I'm sure the witnesses can hear me well enough, so I won't have to shout. Sometimes, there are two sides to a story. But that just doesn't hold true for the events of January 6th and the threat of domestic terrorism we face today. The violent attack of January 6th was perpetrated in significant part by domestic violent extremists espousing white supremacist and anti-government ideologies. No matter how we want to shape questions, that is a fact. Those who promote these same dangerous ideologies are the most lethal threats we face as a country and as a democracy today. As a former prosecutor, I can tell you I feel violent extremism in any form is unacceptable, and I've so prosecuted it that way. But downplaying or distracting from the most clear and present danger we have facing all Americans creates a real danger to the United States. Now, last week, we have to come together as members of the Senate and face reality and the truth. Last week, I asked U.S. Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger what would happen if the Capitol Police were held to last year's fiscal year's funding levels and did not receive increased funding as part of the fiscal year 2022 funding package. He told me it would seriously undermine the ability of the Capitol Police in every way to protect the Capitol. Now, addressing domestic terrorism is a major focus of President Biden's Justice Department FY 22 budget request. The Senate Appropriations Committee has released a bill that would dramatically increase that funding to respond to the dangers. So I'd ask this question, Mr. Olson, if Congress fails to enact these funding increases for fiscal year 22, how would it impact the department's ability to comprehensively respond to the domestic terrorism threats we face?
Thank you, Senator Leahy. I know that the Department of Justice and the administration has submitted a budget request asking for additional resources. And obviously, those resources are being requested because we view those as essential to being able to carry out our mission. So I would just refer you to the submissions from the Justice Department and the President on our budget requests in connection with those appropriations.
And thank you. And Ms. Sanborn, it's good to see you again. I'm one of the ones who's been here long enough to remember when you were a Senate page, and I appreciate the things you've accomplished since then. But can you answer the same question I asked Mr. Olson about these funding increases from the FBI's perspective?
Yes, sir. I am aware that we have requested a budget enhancement. Right now, we use the resources we have and cover down with what we have. But as alluded to by Mr. Olson, we have requested an enhancement specifically for domestic violent extremism.
Thank you. In your testimony, discusses the concrete steps the Justice Department, Justice first, to Mr. Olson, and then Ms. Sanborn. You talked about the concrete steps the Justice Department has taken to implement the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And one critical pillar of that involves confronting the long-term contributors to domestic terrorism, finding ways to counter the influence of dangerous conspiracy theories online, and setting a tone from the highest rank of government. We know that domestic violent extremists pay attention to the rhetoric of political leaders. That includes, for example, the rhetoric calling the jailed January 6 rioters political prisoners, which sends a signal they did nothing illegal. That frightens me. And so, Mr. Olson and Ms. Sanborn, how does misleading political rhetoric and misinformation impact the thinking and actions of domestic violent extremists? Does it impact recruitment and mobilization by these activists? That's my final question.
I'll give a brief answer and refer to Ms. Sanborn, but there's no doubt that misinformation, disinformation, false narratives, as the intelligence community has assessed, are available online to violent extremists. Again, whether that's domestic violent extremists or those who may be influenced by international terrorist groups. And the internet and the availability of social media can be an accelerant to an individual's movement, as you mentioned, Senator, from simply being susceptible to those messages to being further radicalized and eventually to being mobilized to violence. And we've seen this same pattern occur in both the international terrorism context when it comes to ISIS and their propaganda, as we've seen on the domestic violent extremist side with regard to domestic political and social influences. So it's a significant problem.
Did Ms. Sanborn wish to add?
Yes, sir. I would agree with that. Bottom line is violent extremist material on the internet reaches those vulnerable to recruitment, and so we're concerned about that. On the quote-unquote misinformation, we know our adversaries would do whatever they could to include misinformation to sow discord.